Chapter 1: The Contemporary Period in World History. Introduction. History is derived from Latin word historia. It means knowledge through inquiry, research, exploration, and information. Its German name is Geschichte, which connotes an intelligible and significant narrative of the past events. Thus, simply put, history is a narrative of the past events. It records the unique events in the life of mankind. For as Droysen says, history is mankind's knowledge of itself, its self awareness. History is the science of res gestae, or the attempt to answer questions about human actions performed in the past. Lord Acton, in a sense, explains this by saying that history is a unique opportunity of recording, in the way most useful to the greatest number, the fullness of knowledge. With this fullness of knowledge and understanding, man's mind and intelligence have grown, and he has come to discover and fix for himself better ways of living. History is thus as much concerned with knowledge, beliefs, and moral as with social, economic, and political forces. Ever since Herodotus and Thucydides, history has come to be written in various ways and styles and with various purposes and objectives. As Lynon Thorndike wrote, for some history is literature, for others facts, for some an explanation of the present, for others a revelation and a realization of the past. Writing history has indeed been a tricky enterprise, as Durant would suggest. Only a fool would try to compress 100 centuries into 100 pages of hazardous conclusions. Therefore, the need was felt to narrow down the field of history into contemporary parlance and discover a set of working hypotheses for its interpretation. Croce could not have agreed more when he thundered, all history is contemporary history. History is valid for the present in so far as its interpretations are given by the historians from the point of view of present day standards. In this context, it was Voltaire who coined the phrase philosophy of history, among others. Collingwood suggested two ways to work out this philosophy of history, that is, first as special study of a special problem, and then as a contrast of the new historical truths to the old traditional doctrines. The objective behind writing contemporary history is to come to terms with the historical developments that have so characteristically influenced life during the 20th century. Previously, these developments formed part of broader subjects like the history of modern Europe or the history of international relations, which dealt largely with the theme of contemporary history. To study of contemporary history as a specialized subject entails peculiar problems. It involves seeking answers to such questions as how far contemporary history may be regarded as a form of history, or what is the definition of contemporary history, or in what respect does it differ from modern history, or finally, what are its specific features or characteristics. Contemporary historians generally begin with explaining the cause of the disintegration of the world, which obviously led to the emergence of the New World. Therefore, the subject matter of contemporary history came largely to encompass the accounts of the world between the two wars, the peace treaties that emerged out of the Paris Peace Conference, the rise of fascism and Nazism, the conflict between communist and the capitalist blocs that so much characterized the world since 1945, and the breakup of the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia that led to the emergence of a unipolar world. Thus, in a nutshell, contemporary history boils down to a history of the contemporary period of the world. But how does one determine the limits of contemporary history? One plausible answer is that it begins where the modern history ends. Therefore, contemporary history may be defined as that history which records and spans the period through which the historians has lived. According to Barklog, contemporary history begins when the problem which are actual in the present world first takes visible shape. The next question is, how far back can one refer to trace the relevance of contemporary history. For example, French historiography still find in de Gaulle's France the unresolved contrasts to the French Revolution of 1789. Thus, it depends on as to what kind of a problem one is trying to resolve from a historiographical perspective. In the present context, one may regard the period since the World War I as the trend setter in many ways. The fermentation and fusion of nationalist aspirations of people all over the world, and in particular the third world. The decline of the West, through which Spengler explains the end of the European hegemony over world affairs, the coming into being of international organizations like the League of Nations and the UN, United Nations organization, and the rise and decline of upstarts totalitarianism like fascism, Nazism, communism, the growth of science and high technology, the Cold War and bipolarism, the growth of nascent unipolarism. After the collapse of Soviet Union, the problem of poverty nagging the world through the language of suffering and distress, and the primacy of economic over political consideration as reflected in recent trends of terrorism and fundamentalism, etc., constitute the multiple themes of contemporary history. Justifiably, therefore, that contemporary history should commence from World War I is a virtual consensus among historians. But going back to question raised earlier, one has to add that the rise the modern world must form the essential backdrop of the construction and interpretation of the contemporary history of the world. Contemporary period in world history. Contemporary history, as pointed out above, may be defined as the period of recent history, the effects of which are still appreciable at the present time. Its liberal meaning implies belonging to the period to which reference is being made or of the time in which we live. Simply stated, it denotes events happening or existing at the same time. Converted into terms of history, it would refer to the study of historical events and related narrative to the 20th century. In other words, contemporary history moves with the present, while earlier epochs have gradually passed into the domain of general history. According to Fontana Dictionary of Modern Thought, like the serious academic study of the subject, the term goes back to about 1950. It is usually employed to refer to the history of the last 70 years or so through its through in though in France it may refer to history since 1789. States the meaning of contemporary as belonging to the same time, age, or period, living, existing, or occurring together in time. Similarly, according to Cambridge International Dictionary of English 1995, contemporaries are people who live at the same period as each other. Discussing the term in the context of the World War II, historian A.J.P. Taylor emphasizes on the relative nature of the term. What is contemporary today is past tomorrow, and the task of a historian is made all the more though since he or she has to keep all the information and related knowledge updated. As Taylor puts it, contemporary history in the strict sense records events while they are still hot, judging them from the moment and assuming a ready sympathy in the reader. Explaining the origin of the concept of contemporary history, Geoffrey Barraclough, the author of an introduction to contemporary history and one of the first historians to have attempted a definition of contemporary history, remarked that the idea of contemporary history is a newfangled notion introduced after 1918 to pander to the demands of disillusioned public anxious to know what had gone wrong with the war to end all wars. However, not all the historians seem to be convinced about the validity of the subject. Most of them express reservation about the non-availability of crucial document for the study of contemporary history and express doubts about the feasibility of having a correct perspective for recent events, which happen to be so close in times in order to develop objectivity. For a majority of historians, contemporary history does not constitute a separate phase with distinct features, which could differentiate it from the modern phase because of two factors. These are not only that the concept of contemporary is indistinguishable, indefinite, or nebulous, but it also becomes all the more vague with the recent emphasis on the element of continuity in history. However, those who refute this argument contend that contemporary history should be considered as a distinct period of time with characteristics of its own which mark it off from the preceding period, in much the same way as what we call medieval history is marked off from modern history. Distinction between contemporary history and modern history. Contemporary history is undoubtedly a complex field of study. Each aspect or event of contemporary period has its own problems, warrants diverse skills for comprehension, and it mostly interdisciplinary that involves a multifaceted method. Modern history, in contrast, is less cumbersome as it involves a systematic and well documented data eliciting coherent and convincing arguments and interpretations. In contemporary history, the subject matter does not so empathetically imparts value as in modern history. For as one studies the latter, one comprehends what values are more universal and transcend time, and what values are confined only to shorter periods for or particular areas. It is often said that study the historians before you study his history. The reason behind it is the simple fact that each historian is a prisoner of his own age. Historians differ thus in their objective assessment of historical facts as they differ in their points of view. For example, the collapse of Soviet Union might appear to some as inevitable while to others it may appear to be just a contemporary phenomena. Before the now collapsed Soviet Union again springs back into existence with its attendant ideological baggage, study of contemporary history invariably suffers from the lack of detachment on the part of the historians from his subject. Personal interest and group loyalty of the historians frequently makes him involved rather than detached. Contemporary history could be a serious subject of study provided it is studied impartially and without prejudice. The historian must rise above the normal human limitation of being his own witness to the events under study, as his individual reflection otherwise might cloud his perception and stand out in a sharp contrast to the general perception. The recent development in Iraq could be cited as an example. Not all historians in this stance would be inclined to endorse American unilateralism, a stance taken to the determinant of the institutional prestige of the United Nations organization or a major chunk of public opinion around the world, which could hardly be audible in a climate of shock and awe. The modern historian knows the trail of events that he is writing about, but not so in the case with the historians of the contemporary period. The latter is often handicapped by way of not having a comprehensive answer to the why of a particular event, which he has written about. The contemporary scenario is a tangled web. The contemporary historian's success depends largely upon the ability to single out the individuality of an issue vis-a-vis other issues. In such a venture, there is always a lurking temptation to predict or hypothesize as to what the future course of event would be. Selection of data about any particular contemporary event becomes all the more arduous and cumbersome in a world that has gone global. The historian of contemporary period is also continually concerned with change, subtle or gross, as contemporary history always tends to operate in an immensely fluid and constantly becoming environment. He has also to give special attention to the basic structural changes taking place all around him. Fundamental similarities among them, these changes occurring simultaneously in various parts of the world, allow the historians with an objective framework to work upon. After all, it is the prerogative of contemporary history to deal with the constant shifts in power, identify their factors, and hypothesize their impact on the future. An attempt has been made here to show how these two periods of history are different in terms of their quality, content, nature, and scope. Undoubtedly, contemporary history and modern history often tend to overlap each other. But modern history of the world clearly terminated with the events that took place around 1945. The liberation of most of the Afro Asian countries from the colonial yoke brought this turning point decisively. The specific period in modern history might differ from place to place. In Japan, it began with the Meiji Restoration of 1868. In China, modern history starts with Opium Wars between 1839 to 42. The history of modern Europe dates from the French Revolution in 1789. In India, the modern period is generally traced from the advent of European trading companies into India. In comparison to this, contemporary history concerns itself with the only recent past of any country. But on the whole, what made the advent of the contemporary period in the history of the world is the decisive event that brought about a sharp departure from the old world ethos. Notwithstanding the differing views among historians of different schools of thought in this regard, three major differences can be located between the histories of these two periods. The historian of the modern period writes with some degree of detachment, which is not always possible in contemporary history. This becomes so as in the case of modern history, the historian is not a participator in the events that he writes about. In contrast, the contemporary historian is inevitably involved in the contemporary events and hence becomes more of a participator rather than a detached spectator of his subject. For example, it would be hard to imagine anyone writing on the recent Gulf War without holding opinions either for or against the justness of the war. The historians of modern period knows what events followed the subject which he is studying, thus giving him the benefit of hindsight, whereas for the historians of the contemporary period there is no way of knowing what is going to follow the event that he is studying. When a historian writes about the Spanish Civil War, he not only knows the events but also its consequences over the successive centuries. The contemporary historians cannot have the luxury of having this advantage. He is also at odds with the definitive why of a particular event he has written about. The contemporary scenario, in this sense, is a more challenging terrain. Thus, the contemporary historian's success depends largely upon his ability to single out the individuality of the issue vis-a-vis other issues, such as the cause and consequences of the World War II. Then there is the question of evidence of availability of source material, which are found in abundance on the modern period, while the contemporary historians has to make do with only the non-classified materials that is available in the form of reports, articles, surveys, statistics, census, etc. Oral testimony is another important source for the study of contemporary history. It includes interviews in case of the events of current importance and verbally transmitted knowledge in case of other recorded events passed on from one generation to the next. However, historians are still trying to grapple with the problem of attesting to the reliability of such evidences. Selection of data about any particular contemporary event is also an arduous and cumbersome task, particularly in a world that has become so largely interdependent. Thus, contemporary history raises many more questions than what it answers, thereby leaving much scope for further historical research. As such, each aspect or event of contemporary period has its own problems and warrants diverse skills for comprehension. Modern history in this sense is less cumbersome as it involves a systematic approach within a given framework and uses well documented data enabling coherent and congruent argument and interpretations. Those historians who endorses the categorization of contemporary history as a separate domain content while discussing the scope of the subject that the field of contemporary studies is essentially different from that covered by recent modern history. History proper is the recreation of a distant past. In this instance, for contemporary history, how much of this distance could be regarded as distant enough to be left unto the fold of modern history? For instance, in order to study the origins of the World War one could go as far back as 1900 or 1890 or maybe even 1870. Therefore, it would be more acceptable here to begin the survey of contemporary history from those events which have come to shape the contemporary period in a characteristic way. Characteristic features of contemporary history. While delineating the characteristic feature of contemporary history, one has to contend with the ambivalence of the contemporary times. For example, there is already a generation in the contemporary period for whom figures like Pandit Nehru or Sardar Patel are as much historical as Emperor Ashok or Akbar. Obviously, therefore, the first feature of contemporary history could be outlined as elasticity or flexibility of the category. The whole concept is relative. What is contemporary for the present generation may not remain so for the future generations. As a result, the boundaries and content of the subject would keep changing. For instance, for some people, contemporary history could very well start from the post World War II period, whereas for others, the post 1945 years would not come within the purview of history at all. At times, contemporary history is thought to be equated with the comment on current affairs, which indicates a kind of obsession with one aspect or another of the Cold War phenomena. Several shortcomings associated with such journalistic accounts are obvious, as contemporary events require much more depth than any other period of history. For example, while studying the onset and growth of modern industrial society in the world, the contemporary historians will be less concerned with the gradual extension of industrial processes and inventions than with the differences between the industrial revolution of the 18th century and the industrial development of the 20th century. The chief merit of contemporary history lies in its ability to clarify the basic structural changes that shape the modern world. A few examples could be cited here. The ever changing position of various countries, like the emergence of the US and the erstwhile Soviet Union as superpower in the political chessboard of the world, the collapse of imperialism of such countries as Britain, France, and Holland, which dominated much of the world through the 19th and the first half of the 20th century. The emergence of Asian and African countries as independent states, compelling a readjustment of relations between the whites and non-whites, are all such events that would draw different interpretations and opinions, but collectively from a whole which could never be fully understood if torn out of their contemporaneous historical context. It might appear that contemporary history is not very different in its requirement than the history of other periods. But this is not exactly so, as the traditional cause effect approach. It approach is not a sufficient tool for a contemporary historian. While a historian writing on either the ancient, medieval, or modern period starts at a given point in the past and moves forward, the contemporary historian takes his stand in the present and then looks into the past for explanation. For example, a historian would look at the European problems, such as the German, the Italian unification, the rise of the Eastern questions, the impact of growing nationalism, like pan-Slavism on the Habsburg, and the Ottoman empires as arising out of the 1815 Vienna settlement. The interplay of all these questions culminated in the War of 1914. But a contemporary historian will see the same period differently. His starting point would be the global system inherent in international politics, and then his main concern would be to explain how it arose. It is often suggested that contemporary history is conjectural and provisional, and it is based on the assumption and generalization that are culled from the past. but actually the contemporary historians only specifies factors, movements or events which are deemed to have long-term influence on contemporary life both from the macro and micro point of view. This does not make the perspective of the contemporary historians restricted or his approach shallower. In fact, the truth is just the opposite. In order to understand the contemporary events and happening properly, on one has to have an in-depth knowledge of what preceded it. For example, to appreciate the contemporary foreign policy of the US, one would need to know its historical background that might go back to a century if not more. Postmodernism is another aspect which qualifies to be a feature of contemporary history. This dimension of contemporary culture is often overlooked, although it forms an essential element of contemporary life. As of now, postmodernism is a set of ideas which beginning with the 1980s is still confined to the domain of academic discourse. As a concept, it pervades a wide variety of disciplines. That includes art, architecture, music, film, literature, fashion, and technology. Besides, it inherits the ideas of multiplicity and provisionality in all spheres of life, be it political, social, aesthetic, economics, or technological. Occasionally, the rise of religious fundamentalism as a form of resistance or questioning or of the established order is cited as a postmodernistic phenomenon. Naturally, therefore, because of the pervasiveness of many such disjunctions in the contemporary society and polity, postmodernism as a framework is attracting the attention of both liberal and radical minded people. Summing up the discussion, one might say that the contemporary history is a balance between historical facts and perception of contemporary values. The historian of contemporary history, like his counterparts dealing with the ancient, medieval, and modern history, possesses an access to the antecedent of a happening or an event, but unlike the latter, he can only hypothesize about their result or consequences. He lacked the advantage of reviewing the events from a hindsight. Thus, despite being closer to the event, he is farther from its result or consequences. But as a distinct field to study, contemporary history scores over others in the context of evidences. Being the biographer of his own times, the historian here can delve into potential historical sources to find answer to his questions. The quantity of evidence or historical data is enormous in the contemporary history, though it might lack the quality of evidence that is used in other categories of history. However, the closer the proximity of the contemporary historian to the event of his study, the more important and the obvious becomes its result. He understands that change is the order of his time, and so he tries to figure out all structure changes to single out the basic ones for historical investigation. No historian of the contemporary period can do justice to his study if he fails to perceive or clarify or elaborate the structural changes that has shaped the modern world. Civilization is a movement and not a harbor, a journey and not a destination. Contemporary history imbibes and reflects this movement. Movement implies comparison. The historian thus goes by the comparative dictums of progressive and reactionary, the conservatives and liberal, instead of getting into such uncompromising absolutes as good and bad. It is contemporary alone which had all through the crap and crud of the evolving civilization held aloft for man the mirror of what has been genesis of human intellectual growth and partial achievements. Faith in the future of society has always been, though faith in contemporary history. Contemporary history is similar to the history in the general method of inquiry. In approach and in techniques, its specificity lies only in its application of historical thinking to the present. It can only be approached with a professional attitude where the question asked are more significant than the answer given to them. A survey of the historical background of the contemporary world. The dynamic view of the contemporary history begins with the period from about the end of the 19th century, which saw the gathering of the storm leading to the World War I between 1914 and 18. This period was interspersed interspersed with such cataclysmic events as the Russian Revolution in 1970 and the entry of the United States into the war. Another dynamic phase began with the onset of the bipolar world order, which began immediately after the conclusion of the World War II and continued until the Cold War ended in 1991. The intervening period between the two world wars and was also not less dynamic. It provided the crucial link between the parceling out of the old world order into the womb of history and the beginning of the new world order. In the beginning of the 21st century, we are now beholden to another world order in the making. No theory of contemporary history could develop till 1940 because of the Eurocentric view of the dominant historians from the West, which not only preceded them but also prevented them from developing in any universal outlook or postulations about the history of the world. Besides, the post 1940 contemporary history was more concerned with the current affairs than an integral view of international politics. The Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, rise of totalitarian credos like fascism in Italy and Nazism in Germany, and the policy of appeasement pursued by Great Britain, and even the issues of disarmament were seen from a local or at best regional or continental perspective. The contemporary events were also viewed from a legalistic, moralistic perspective of good and bad. The only redeeming feature was the institutionalization of international relations through international organization and law, an element of idealism too crawled into the realms of contemporary history. Thus, till 1939, the three major thrust areas of contemporary history were the international law, political reformism, and political history. The post 1945 scenario shifted the focus of contemporary history to factors and forces which governed the conduct of nations in a truly international environment. Factors accounting for such a change in focus were the end of colonialism, radical developments in science and technology, emergence of new nations, and along with them new values, increasing economic interdependence, demographic shifts, transnational ideologies, and the increasing primacy of international organizations. In the life of nations and communities, contemporary history had to take into account all these factors and thereby assume more holistic character. In the 1950s and 60s, and to some extent even in the early years of the 21st century, the commonly held notion is that the end of the 18th century marked the onset of the technical and industrial age as a natural corollary to the industrial revolution. It is considered as a turning point with such far reaching consequences that it imparts the 19th century as a sort of contemporary quality. As far as the 20th century is concerned, a number of trends emerged which fundamentally altered the notions about and the concept of contemporary history. The most significant events during the last decade of this century were the fall of Berlin Wall, the reunification of Germany, and above all the collapse of Soviet Union. These events coming within a short span of time between 1889 and 1991 dramatically shifted the focus of research to contemporary history. The end of the bipolar world order marking the end of the 20th century led to an execution of this focus. Incompatibility between the national interest is the dominant factor behind all conflicts and changes. The rise of new states, the threats of external subversion, the nuclear arms race, and the failure of armed control efforts, the preponderance of superpower politics, the rise of new non state actors, and the ugly growth of fundamentalism and terrorism have rendered the old approaches toward the study of contemporary history virtually obsolete. A redeeming feature is that the use of force in any conflict is frowned upon as a risk that might lead to a nuclear holocaust. The balance of power in the world as of now is heavily titled, but imperatives of peace come as a conjunction between international politics and international organization. The cumulative impact of it all on contemporary history has been that of an endeavor to subordinate scattered happening to a higher goal of peaceful human coexistence on the planet called Earth.